This is Jim, and
receiving this message. We are Ken Jennings and John Roderick. We speak to you from our present, which we can only assume is your distant past, the turbulent time that was the early 21st century.
Fearing the great cataclysm that will surely befall our civilization, we began this monumental reference of strange and obscure human knowledge. These recordings represent our attempt to compile and preserve wonders and esoterica that would otherwise be lost.
So whether you're listening from an advanced civilization or have just reinvented the technology to decrypt our transmissions, this is our legacy to you.
This is our time capsule. This is the Omnibus.
You have accessed entry 1411.SS0604, certificate number 39950. War rugs.
The Afghan carpet industry has been around for centuries, and most of them who have learned it from their parents. It's currently the largest Afghan export, so it's absolutely crucial to the economy in terms of generating income as well. There are over 100 types of wool available that is used in carpets.
Have you ever been to Afghanistan?
I have never been to Afghanistan.
It seems like the type of thing that one of us would have done.
Well, I mean, there's a whole generation of American men in many states who have been to Afghanistan. It's probably like the country most Americans have been to after Mexico and Iraq. Canada's in fourth.
There was a brief period there where I felt like maybe I would go to Afghanistan before 9/11. There was sort of a peaceful interregnum where it seemed like you could walk the Silk Road, which was a type of thing that I once dreamt I would do.
Well, before the whole Soviet/Taliban/US morass in Afghanistan, it was a very romantic part of the world for a lot of the West. You know, it's the Hindu Kush in Kipling novels. It's Kim and the Man Who Would Be King, and as you say, the Silk Road. It's the fact that it's, you know, kind of landlocked and mountainous makes it seem like a nice rugged destination for a certain kind of old-timey Anglophile kid.
Yeah, well, you know, the reason that was such a romantic Kipling-esque place was that the British were engaged in a variety of like
skullduggery,
colonial wars there. They got, you know, the mountains in that region were the natural extent of British India.
Mm-hmm.
And so the British were constantly trying to refine that border and pacify Afghanistan, and they continually failed. They had their little British hats handed to them 3 separate occasions, but it was a place where a generation of Victorian British army people made their bones or lost their bones.
I guess, yeah, I shouldn't give the impression that the morass started with the Soviet invasion, because Europe's had some fingers in the Afghani pie for a long time.
Well, Afghanistan,
I'm sure the pie is some kind of a handheld meat pie. I don't know what they eat in Afghanistan. They do play the game. Don't they play the game where they ride around on horses and hit a human head with hammers or whatever?
That came later. I think that the original game, as shown in the great film Rambo 3.
Do you get Rocky 3 and Rambo 3 confused?
I do.
I love when Rambo goes to Afghanistan and has to fight Mr. T.
Rambo 3, where they're playing the game on horseback, where they're using a sheep as the object, as effectively the ball, right?
They're just whacking. Is it a dead sheep?
No, it's a dead sheep, but you grab it and you're riding along holding a dead sheep by the leg, and you're, I think, trying to throw it into a basket or something, but then the other team comes up and grabs the sheep out of your hand. It's much more, you know, a ball game like polo is a metaphor. The game is a metaphor. This is much closer to probably the original sport of give me that sheep.
The sport is called buzkashi, which literally means goat pulling in Persian. So it essentially is give me that sheep.
Give me that sheep. And I feel like that's what polo is effectively. It's just we've turned the sheep into a ball and put hammers on in between.
Pretty much all of our pastimes started out with a sheep. Like before there was reading, people would just sit and hold a sheep open and kind of stare at it. And eventually
chase the sheep. There's hide from the sheep. Another great game.
And I've never seen Rambo 3. So when does Thunderlips come out?
Oh, so Rambo 3 is a great example of a mid-'80s American sort of agitprop, like propaganda film. But at the time, the Mujahideen were our allies, and it was the Soviet Union that we were fighting a proxy war against.
So are there clips of Rambo being like, Osama bin Laden is the greatest hero in military history?
I mean, effectively, he's wearing one of those little boiled wool hats and is mobbed up with the heroic rebels against the Soviet helicopters and invading troops. We've gotten a lot of feedback from listeners that I pronounce the word Soviet with an L, Soviet.
And have you decided to stop?
There's nothing I can do about it.
Oh, you're leaning in to the Soviets.
All of my pronunciations are I don't feel like I'm in command of them anymore. So the Soviets.
You're just a vessel.
I am. I'm the prophet of the true word of God, which is to put extra letters into everything and mess up all the Latin endings, the Latin pluralizations.
So this is, this is a historical record, John, and not your little war movie podcast.
Whatever.
But you guys have not done Rambo 3 on your other show?
No, not yet.
It must have seemed like a fun twist for Stallone to be like, our Vietnam is Vietnam, but their Vietnam is Afghanistan. So it must have seemed like a very contemporary reversal to have Rambo in Afghanistan.
It really was. And the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan.
You just did it again.
I did it again. Was a real, we'd been fighting proxy wars with the USSR throughout the 20th century in Angola and in Egypt and all these different places where we were effectively fighting America versus Russia battles, but where the risk of...
Right, the great innovation of no troops.
Right. Well, and the risk of nuclear contention was off the table because we could test our new jet planes in little conflicts between Egypt and Israel, but there wasn't a risk really to us of that escalating into a major conflict.
And everybody kind of knows nobody's going to destroy a planet over Angola, right?
Well, that's the presumption. But when Russia invaded Afghanistan, the USSR, not Russia, what Russia has always lacked is a warm water southern port that doesn't have to go through the Bosphorus, right? Their only southern ports are on the Black Sea.
Out the Black Sea.
And so they were always...
They're constipated. They're a country without an excretory system.
That's right. They can't get out into the wider ocean.
They've got... You know how it is when there's all this stuff you want to pump into a nice, clean ocean of water.
Potty.
And you can't do it.
Right.
There's just Mongolia cock blocking you.
And even up in the Baltic Sea, right, they just have a very narrow little area there between... Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and Finland. They just have a kind of a small outlet. And so although they have a giant Pacific coast, there was no sort of warm water way into the Arabian Sea or to the south.
And we should explain to the future that this was a time when there was actually sea ice in the Arctic for much or all of the year. Something you guys have never seen.
Right. Our future listeners are like, why don't they just go over the short route over the pole?
In their day, doggy paddling is called polar bear paddling because that's all polar bears do.
But this was an area, if you think about between Russia and the South, this was back to Catherine the Great. But the USSR had assimilated Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and now they came up against this wall of Iran and Afghanistan.
But what's the game plan, man? Afghanistan's landlocked. Did nobody tell them?
It is, but then they can, and they were.
Are they like Pakistan's next, baby?
Well, and Pakistan was part of both Afghanistan and Pakistan were part of the greater USSR sphere of influence.
Right. That's another proxy war you get between India and Pakistan.
But there was a tremendous Afghani resistance. So they had a puppet government in there for a long time, but there was this resistance movement. There was this, Afghanistan has long been called the graveyard of empires. So everybody kind of tries to come through here and beat them up, and they mount this significant resistance in this impassable mountain terrain. And no matter your technological advantage or your numerical superiority, you crash up against this impassable range, and it's the end of you.
And the hills are full of sturdy, crafty freedom fighters
who are living in caves in Tora Bora. And so in 1947, right, there was a partition between India and Pakistan. The Greater British India encompassed both of those territories, and half of it, the northwestern half, was largely Muslim, and then the majority of India was Hindu.
And Gandhi dreamed that this could be one country, that they could get past the Hindu-Muslim resentments.
Right, but it turned out after the partition in 47, that was not possible, and there was a giant then diaspora of Muslims headed, who had been living in India for generations, headed to the west into newly formed Pakistan, and Hindus headed east.
And interestingly, also some Muslims headed east because Bangladesh at the time was part of Pakistan.
Isn't that, and so called East Pakistan.
You just have a big island of India in the middle. So, Muslims had two options depending on, which goal line they were closest to.
Yeah, do you want the mountain one, or do you want the sort of swampy one?
Do you want the graveyard of empires or the tornado alley?
Oh, yeah, that's true. Yeah, we were just talking about the tornadoes of Bangladesh.
So they're both graveyards of something.
So the Mujahideen fighting this heroic war against the Russians, the invasion of Afghanistan in 1980 was the reason that Jimmy Carter...
Sure, there's a generation of angry American archers and steeplechasers.
Right, he canceled the 1980 Olympics for the United States.
They never got to go to the Moscow Olympics.
And then the Russians, tit for tat, didn't come to our 1984 Olympics, which is right about when Sylvester Stallone gave them the titty twister.
It is kind of a funny thing that, through this accident of geopolitics and Olympic city awarding, Russia and the United States were each hosting their first Summer Olympics.
Back to back.
Russia ever, the U.S. in quite a while. And, Carter would not have boycotted an Olympics anywhere but Moscow, right?
Yeah, and I think it was part of his... he felt vulnerable at being... he felt politically vulnerable being called a pacifist or not hard enough on the Soviet Union, because this was an era of brinksmanship, and the Republican Party and Ronald Reagan in particular were campaigning against Jimmy Carter as
we're the Cowboys now,
right? And they're the peaceniks now. In fact, it turns out Jimmy Carter was a real hawk. He was the first president to reform the whole continuity of government program. This was all kind of happening in secret. He was the first president to actually test all that stuff. There was an incident where they were sitting in the White House talking about like what would happen in the event of a nuclear war. And I think Brzezinski, his national security advisor, said, "Okay, let's go now." And all the military advisors were like, "What?" And he said, "Now, we just got a message that they've launched. Let's go." And they were like, what? And he was like, "Let's go." And so all of a sudden, frantically, these guys are running around the White House calling and the helicopters coming to take the president away. And the point was... Did
anybody know Brzezinski was going to do this?
No, he was just like, it just popped into his head and he was like,
audible.
"Let's go." And
classics of Big New.
And so the cars are driving all over and mass hysteria, dogs and cats sleeping together. But in fact, they they more or less pulled it off. But Carter was the first one to actually do this in all the post-war history. this, the American response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan very much was resonating against our recent, let's call it, defeat in Vietnam.
It was a tie. It's like Kevin Kline in A Fish Called Wanda.
Because there was no question that the Soviet Union was supporting North Vietnam with money and material. And we were still quite bruised from it. And this was our opportunity for a little bit of get back. And in fact, it was a similar situation, not in the jungle in the high desert, but a more or less technologically primitive local resistance against, the powerhouse of the early 80s Soviet Union, arguably at the height of their military power.
And once the Cold War ended, I think we saw that, just how many similarities there were, just a whole generation of haunted Russian veterans, just as we had in this country. And, just what it did to the national character, the idea that your vaunted army could just get into an unwinnable war.
A war of attrition.
In a small Asian country that was unpopular and had to be propped up by generations of leaders, finally some who didn't even vote for it. And what it did to the country as well, between 1 and 2 civilians killed in Vietnam, similar numbers in Afghanistan, a whole country decimated by somebody else's proxy war.
Yeah, and in this case, the CIA in particular was really deeply enmeshed with the Mujahideen.
Bless you.
Thank you. The Russians had the advantage with North Vietnam of actually having quite a bit more proximity, and the Chinese as well.
You mean as opposed to the U.S. that had to ship everything across an ocean, or?
Yeah, right. We were not local to Central Asia, but we made really close friends with them, and were very visible there. They were using brand new American rocket launchers, so the heightened hostilities of the 80s. I mean, the Soviets had a lot of cause to feel like that we were propping up the rebels.
Mm-hmm.
And then after the end of the war, we all rejoiced after the Russians departed. Everyone rejoiced at a new free Afghanistan, which almost immediately became a Muslim autocracy.
Taliban take over and impose Sharia law.
Right. And then everyone knows the story that after the first Gulf War, American troops in Saudi Arabia really offended Osama bin Laden. And from his little redoubt there in Taliban, Afghanistan, he mounted what became an endless war against terror.
It's a funny thing about, that kind of paternal feeling about Saudi Arabia as the center of, something we don't see. We just think of it, it's oil-rich desert, The idea that would be somebody's Jerusalem or Vatican,
right?
And that any foreign troops anywhere inside the border is essentially is like marching through a cathedral.
Yeah,
something that's hard for us to understand.
Yeah, particularly since the holiest cities in Saudi Arabia and in the Muslim world are all over on the west coast of Saudi Arabia on the Red Sea, and our troops and most of our involvement in Saudi Arabia is way over on the east coast near Kuwait and Qatar. But still, you're right. It's a defilement of the whole region.
Do you feel like it's a pretext? Like really, Osama knows that they're hundreds of miles away from anything good? Saudi Arabia is huge. Saudi Arabia is much bigger than Alaska.
It's big. Hey, easy. Careful there, mister.
Size isn't everything. Is there really the sense that the modern borders of Saudi Arabia mean anything at all? Or is this really just U.S. boots on the ground anywhere in the Muslim world in the future caliphate would have been just as offensive? I don't know.
I don't know, because I am not a
Muslim
fanatic. I don't think it's a case of...
A lot of people don't know this about you. You are not a Islamist fanatic.
I'm not, but also, I mean, if you think about there are comparable feelings about Jerusalem, obviously, like people are fighting over, and have been for centuries, over the occupation of the Temple Mount.
And its symbolic value even in our day, as you know, what it can be the capital of and what embassies can be there can still ignite firestorms today, 1,000 years after Crusades.
And probably even when futurelings are listening, even though there's a one universe government that is completely peaceful.
Jerusalem is still partitioned between 86 religious groups. Here we are in Methodist Jerusalem, but
the Samaritans, there are only 4 of them left, but they're living there on top of a tower.
And there's like one Christian Science reading room in the middle. That's all Mary Baker Eddy gets.
Yeah, I really loved the idea of Jerusalem as an open city, like an internationalist city, a Mos Eisley, if you will.
But, a wretched hive of scum and villainy?
But no one in the international community seemed to take me up on that.
They don't want your lively bazaar.
No, these are not the Torahs you're looking for. So another thing that happened within Afghanistan during this period was an evolution in the way that what we call Oriental rugs were being produced.
Are we still saying Oriental rugs?
So Oriental rug is, we would not say an Oriental person, but Oriental as a description of a rug is still the preferred nomenclature.
When I was in college, the flavors of cup and noodle in the supermarket were like chicken, pork, and Oriental.
Yeah.
Which I guess implies that, you know, one kind contains chicken and the other kind contains Orientals. Do they still have Oriental cup and noodle? Maybe not.
It's sort of like we still use the terms East and West when we talk about civilizations, even, I guess, or cultures. And
sure. I guess the problem with Orient is it defines it as to the east of what, you know, like there are people that, you know, East Asia has historically thought itself as being in the middle of the world. And we're like, nope, you're to the east of us, and that's what we call you.
Yeah, and I mean, you could say that that's how it's described in the English language, and so there's an argument, I guess, to be made that in English you wouldn't put Asia in the center of the map.
There is still Oriental flavor top ramen, by the way.
Is there really?
In our day, yeah. I guess it's like a fossil word, like which happens a lot with these kind of no longer acceptable or sensitive ethnic words. Like I think you can still say Negro spiritual. And
remember, there's that population of indigenous people.
Right. We talked about the Negritos of Southeast Asia. That's true.
Right. So, and I think in large part, it's a part of speech that the word Oriental, when you're describing a carpet, you're describing it as characteristic. It's an adjective, characteristic of, whereas
it's a small o.
It's a small o, right, rather than a large o. But Oriental carpets are in and of themselves sort of a misnomer in that you don't think of Morocco or even Kazakhstan necessarily as the Orient, or at least anymore.
Sure.
The usage of that word changed a lot during World War II, when the Orient was really solidified as this area, this sort of opium war, Southeast Asia and particularly Pacific Asia.
China and Japan, and because that's the military theater.
Right.
I see.
But Oriental carpets, as we think of them, are actually produced in this kind of enormous and majority Muslim stripe that starts in Morocco, which is sort of famous for their carpets.
Morocco touches the Atlantic, not what we would call the Orient.
Right.
It's like part of it goes west of Spain, I think.
All the way across Algeria, Libya, through the Middle East, Turkey, and then this sort of Caspian area, Iran, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan.
Carpet's so important in Turkmenistan that they actually put carpet designs on their national flag.
Mm-hmm.
The flag of Turkmenistan, in addition to the usual stripes and crescent moons and stars and whatever flags have, has a strip of like the 5 most important carpet gulls, carpet designs from the country. Like that's their bald eagle or Eiffel Tower or British Crown, you know, like the peak of their culture is
these carpets.
A carpet design.
And those actually have just been recently granted UNESCO historic preservation status.
Like it's a World Heritage Site?
It's a World Heritage Site, their carpet industry. And then carpets continue through Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan all the way into that Western China as part of culturally part of their patrimony.
They are no longer means of transportation, though. You don't see a lot of the flying carpets anymore.
No, that's a really problematic reference.
Is that right? Is that Orientalist?
No, I don't think so. I think you can get away with it.
Actually, I don't know if that's legit or not. Like, is that a European trope that the East has flying carpets, or are there actual
legends of
Arabian Nights text about this, or is this all Richard Francis Burton's idea that there would be flying carpets?
You referenced it a little bit earlier. The Orientalism that was sort of popularized by Edward Said in his book of the same name,
which we should explain to the future, is just the idea that there's kind of a fun, exotic version of Asia in the Western mind that actually services real Middle Easterners poorly.
Particularly in the 19th century and early 20th century, this idea of the exotic Orient, it was similar to the 18th century idea of Aboriginal people as being noble and untainted by vice. And so, although it was very patronizing and simplified them, but it did it in the form of celebrating them or lifting them up. Like, oh, look at these beautiful, exotic, these all the paintings of the time portrayed these harems like arrayed around the feet of a pasha, and wasn't that fascinating?
The pasha didn't get a lot of the benefit of the noble, Indian chief who's in touch with the land. I mean, really, part of the appeal was, and he's got a big curved sword, and he'll just cut off your head. He doesn't care,
super exciting, titillating.
Oh yeah, like boys' adventure stuff,
right?
But not being praised for any kind of super ethical behavior, maybe, except a weird kind of internal honor we don't understand.
True. But I think that honor is absolutely not just exotic, but also exalted. There are certain aspects of it that to a Christian nation would have seemed like Buddhism or Hinduism, a kind of perhaps alternate.
It's wish fulfillment in that this guy can have 12 beautiful veiled wives, and look at these amazing banquets he puts on, and so it is admiring. It's a kind of admiration.
I remember
kind of a weird, distorted one.
Reading Orientalism in college, I absolutely spent a lot of time poring over the illustration on the book cover and was like, as bad as this is, I do admire the aesthetic.
Look at these domes and these veiled women. Yeah, I think Edward Said is not happy with you spending more time on the cover.
No, he's still mad. And of course, this was also the era. I mean, the Alhambra was visitable in Spain. We had access to
beautiful Moorish architecture.
Yeah, and I think Europe was engaged in millennia of conflict with with invaders from the East. So it wasn't like we were just admiring them from afar. We also were terrified.
You're admiring them from Jafar?
Oh.
Don't admire him. He's the worst.
That's why you get the gold star.
By the way, magic carpets are legit. They are from real Arabian folktales. They are not Arabian and Persian folktales. They are not a Western interpolation.
Well, and these rugs and carpets were originally very practical items in all of these countries. They were
how so?
Well, I mean, a rug is very practical.
Ties the room together.
It really ties the room together. But you can pile them on top of a frame and make a shelter. Particularly if you're a nomadic people, you roll up the rugs and take them with you, and then you can unroll them on the desert floor at night and throw them over some pieces of wood, and all of a sudden you have a pretty comfortable shelter. Easily transportable and easily traded.
So it's not just what we would think of as a rug, like, something to wipe your shoes on or to change the color of a room. It's actually, it's sleeping and maybe sitting on it around a low table, or it's a more important even object of furniture, right?
Absolutely. And there's a lot of nomadism just naturally in this region. It's a sort of major part of how the original Arabians, I mean, until after World War I, most of those were nomadic tribes.
I mean, we were nomadic people before agriculture, and guess what? In the Arabian desert, not a lot of reason to sit still.
Well, and before agriculture, we were also located, I mean, our forebears also come from this area. It's, it's the cradle of civilization, literally.
That's what I hear.
That's what they say.
Not the graveyard of empire.
Also, the Graveyard of Empire was just to the
cradle,
right.
From cradle to grave, it's like less than 1,000 miles.
And somehow Iran is right in the middle
Iran's
of all
middle
this.
age.
And we talk about Persian carpets also being a big, that was maybe even closer to the classic carpet, the Persian carpet.
The carpets you want to talk about are Baluch, right? They belong to the nomads of Baluchistan.
Yeah, Baluchistan, which is one of the tribal areas in Afghanistan.
It kind of overlaps. It's kind of at where Iran and Afghanistan and Pakistan meet. It's along the lines of your Moldavia. It's a historical region that is no longer a political boundary.
Well, as these areas, so the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan was predictably established by the British. And even to this day, there's a lot of dispute in that region. There's a tremendous border disputes between Pakistan and India in Kashmir.
Mm-hmm.
That's still an armed conflict.
And potentially a nuclear one.
But between Afghanistan and Pakistan, that border is not accepted by the Afghanis. So you can imagine that what it does is it pushes a little bit too far into traditional Afghani territory. But carpets were very practical items, and they were also items that were very signaling. You could put your the patterns were encoded with different information about your tribe and who your people were and how the carpets were made. They were exclusive to different regions, and they became a thing that you would trade or barter or use as, in the absence of flags, even use as identifiers.
It's a national symbol.
But as the colonial expansion happened and across the Silk Road, I mean, this was also the crossroads of civilization. It wasn't just that they were being invaded.
First it was a graveyard.
Yep.
Then it was a cradle.
That's right.
It's also a crossroads?
That's right.
Is the crossroads between the grave and the cradle?
The thing is, if you go down to the crossroads and try to catch a ride, yeah, you're going to end up in one of those things.
I went to the crossroads of civilization and tried to sell my soul to the devil, and I still cannot play the...
harmonica,
balalaika. I don't know. What are they playing over there?
They play
the zither.
They play goats. Actually, they string them up. And
I tried to sell my soul to the devil to become a better buzkashi player.
Yeah.
It didn't work.
It's like a tub bass, doom 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 doom, but you just got to pull the string, the gut tighter. So then they became trade items, right? And a lot of the rug manufacture then was done primarily for export. And as time went on...
Discovered by the West probably pretty early. Like, I'm assuming that Dutch and Venetian merchants were like, check out these. These are 1 million times better than any carpet we have. And you show it off as a sign of your mercantile wealth.
And in particular...
It's a middle class thing.
A middle class reference to Orientalism. To have an Oriental carpet...
It's adventure, too.
Yeah, in your Dutch row house is to say... that you are a person of the world, and it's to, in a way, kind of set the scene of an exotic almost, I mean, it references to your middle-class house guests, a kind of opium-soaked harem that
you only aspire to in Rotterdam.
Or it might be, it's the scene that says like, hey, key party tonight.
They had no idea that, in our time, their city would be an opium-soaked harem. That was still centuries away.
Yeah, at the time, I think it was still largely Lutheran.
It was Lutheran
and Calvinist.
Yes, it was a wooden shoe-based economy. That's why you needed carpets. You don't want your wooden shoe clicking on the floor. This was also the time when it was very popular to show maps on your wall. This was the golden age of cartography. And that was a popular form of decor, just to show a map of the African coast or the Red Sea or something, because it really does show, this is my interest in the globe. This is perhaps my mercantile expanse. Yeah, it's a sign of sophistication.
Well, and a lot of the motifs evolved over time, and it takes about a year to weave even a medium-sized Oriental carpet in the traditional manner. So they quickly became kind of a thing that as you could weave these and export them and earn money, they became maybe more expensive to even the population of people who were making them.
It's the kind of thing where, like, as soon as white people discover quinoa, suddenly that's no longer a cheap thing for Ecuadorians to eat.
Right. Now it's organic, and
because they can get a much better price from Whole Foods.
Right. So fast forward to the Soviet invasion and occupation of Afghanistan. During this period, the residents of Baluchistan, the Baluch people, started to incorporate images into their rugs of war material, grenades, helicopters.
Wow. So modern war material.
Pistols.
Kalashnikovs.
And this was not a tradition that went back thousands of years.
Like, would they have even crossed swords or whatever? Or
no, it evolved sort of in fairly recent times, that the motifs would be not just completely geometric, but somewhat figurative, birds and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
But as the Soviet war progressed, these carpets started to appear that were woven with this military iconography,
grenades and stuff.
And the theory, there are a lot of theories about war rugs, but the initial theory was that they were designs of resistance meant to communicate to other people in the region a kind of it was a coded reference to their resistance to the occupation. So they were graphical elements that you could look at these rugs and not see helicopters and grenades because you're not expecting it.
Right. It's a very funny juxtaposition. It would be like seeing hieroglyphics, but the pharaoh's holding an iPad or something, because it's this ultimate ancient art form, this kind of timeless looking woven thing. And then suddenly there's a modern Soviet assault rifle
right
in the middle of it.
Yeah, and I think that probably to Russian soldiers who were occupying Afghanistan, they thought that was pretty funny too.
It's a souvenir industry.
And so they started buying these rugs. And then the rugs started to be manufactured specifically for a Russian soldier.
Because your buddy comes home and like, hey, Sergey got a rug. We got to get one of those rugs like Sergey got.
Right, because think of the Orientalism in that. It's like this strange memento of their war.
And it's got military iconography, the kind of thing that young military guys will put on their biceps.
Well, sure. This is a thing where you get back and all of a sudden your apartment that used to have just Lamborghini posters on it now also has this totally rad war rug. And so the iconography kind of blew up at this time. And go ahead.
If you've lived anywhere near an army base, you know how much the economy is based around the guys on the base, not just the dealers selling orange Corvettes or whatever, but also just even the clubs and the diners. And I grew up near an overseas army base in South Korea, and it becomes this weird thing where there becomes a kind of a weird border area of economy that's only aimed at like 20-something GIs away from home for the first time, buying the dumbest stuff.
Well, you think about the satin jacket with an embroidered map of Korea.
That's
on the
exactly
back.
what I was going to say. A members only jacket with like Korea and kind of, because amazing embroidery there for low labor costs.
Right.
So the word Korea in some kind of weird Old English or Orientalist font, and then a map with maybe a tiger. And that was like the nice stuff. That was the, it gets progressively kitschier. There's definitely the guy calligraphying people's names, but it's not actual calligraphy. It's more like the R is going to be a pagoda with a dragon, and the S is a, the kind of thing, right? The S is a waterfall, and, in these bright day glow colors. And then it got even kitschier. There'd be whole stands of, just T-shirts with these kind of awful sexualized sayings about the kind of things the kind of antics that GIs get up to when they got a weekend pass, and maybe weirdly explicit references that hopefully even the people making the mugs and the T-shirts didn't understand. It's a crazy kind of shadow industry. And I love the idea that Oriental rugs might have been like the Soviet equivalent, or Soviet, if you will, equivalent.
Well, and what's super interesting is that now there's a secondary market, a vintage clothing market for those satin jackets with maps of Korea on them. They are now no longer just a gross thing that a GI brings back, but now a kitsch item for snobs.
I didn't know this. So there's snobs going to thrift stores hoping to find one of these vintage.
You used to be able to find them all the time in thrift stores, and now they're only in vintage stores.
So I lived blocks away from thousands of these, and I didn't know that it was essentially, vinyl gold.
And probably even those weirdly sexual explicit t-shirts, if they're from the 1970s and 80s, some kid somewhere in Los Angeles is wearing it right now. But the secondary market,
if only I had kept in my basement just hundreds of t-shirts that say "Make her sleep in the wet spot," I'd be a billionaire now.
Well, but you can go crazy with that. You could have bought a 59 Les Paul in 1976 for what at the time would have been an extraordinary $2,000. And, now it's worth $600,000.
That's what you would do if you went back in time. You wouldn't actually buy IBM stock. You would just get a guitar.
No, I would definitely buy IBM stock. I think if you just put your money in the stock market, it would do just fine. But there became then within the Russian, because Russians are not strangers to irony, and Russian soldiers were buying
They've read Chekhov. They love,
That's right.
They love that kind of brittle, tragicomic approach to life.
It's deeply in there. And so these rugs started to feature giant AK-47 Kalashnikov rifles, and
so it was subtle, and then it got
not subtle.
Because, it's 20-year-old GIs.
And then there was an entire genre of these carpets that just had a giant map of Afghanistan with Russian tanks all headed back to Russia.
So they're buying stuff about their own defeat.
Yeah. And with, like rocket launchers and stuff like actually on the map, literally on the map. And there is a theory, and it's being sort of put forth by this guy, Kevin Sudaith, who was the American guy who really decided that war rugs were, that he was going to popularize these things as art.
Is he a scholar, or did he bring them into his gallery and make a ton of money?
He's an American sort of, he's doing it from an art and archaeological or anthropological rather standpoint. He's a New Yorker. He has a theory that, in fact, there was an artist here in the United States, or I'm sorry, he was an Italian artist that actually contracted rug makers in this region to make maps for him in textiles as part of his production of his own art. And his geographical vocabulary had an influence on the rug makers who had been doing this contract work as they started to make map rugs themselves.
So they start to turn more into risk boards just because of this Italian guy.
Right.
I'm sure there are a bunch of, so thanks to this American guy, now there's Upper West Side apartments that have these very exotic items.
He has been popularizing them for a long time. And in fact, I dated a girl about 10 years ago in New York who worked for him. And part of her job was they were exporting these rugs and finding them. And there's a long history of them since, in the second half of the 20th century. So you can now find early versions of this where tanks are very geometric and hardly visible as tanks.
Stylized.
All the way up until these rugs that have Kalashnikovs on them. And then after the Russians were gone and the Americans became the number one market.
Yes. They must have been so happy. New invaders to buy our rugs.
Yeah. And they started actually having English words on them. And for a long time, celebrating the defeat of the Russians. This was before the United States became embroiled in a war, but English speakers and Western tourists were there and really like lolling over these Kalashnikov.
And it seems that the Taliban turned a blind eye, even though this is the kind of artistic expression that they would be blowing up in statue form. But so they let the cottage industry go, I guess.
The Taliban was always extremely against representative images in art.
Sure.
And like
Except
you say,
Kalashnikov.
But they allowed this because, it was earning money. And then when the Americans got into a war there, again, the rugs started to change. And in fact, there's an entire genre of them called the 9/11 rug.
I saw the 9/11 rugs.
Where they're twin towers exploding and jet planes. And
The funny thing is they're not that different than some kitschy art you could buy down on Canal Street, like just never forget stuff.
but hand woven into these
Right.
kind of beautiful wool rugs.
And they're kind of weirdly, like, they don't say, yay, 9/11, but there's something celebratory about seeing these detailed depictions of the crashes.
Well, and a major theme of them is a band across the middle that has an Afghani flag on one side, an American flag on the other, and then the dove of peace in the middle. But it's a pretty graphic depiction of the Twin Towers, including hand-stitched little people jumping off the roof of the World Trade Center in the rug.
I saw one that had, plane impacts marked with lettering saying second plane hits tower, like almost as if you're hearing the CNN guy speaking at you through the rug like it's a comic panel.
And this rug would be a very different thing in Afghanistan than it is on on Canal Street. And Kevin Sudith,
You have no idea.
I have no idea. It's Sudeith. What would you say? Sudeith?
Sudeith? Maybe?
Yeah, let's say Kevin Sudeith. He would often set up a stall at these at a bazaar displaying these rugs. And it was a real controversy in New York City because people would walk by
double take
and be really triggered by seeing these rugs. Like, what are you doing? And he would say, well, this is an art form. And I'm appreciating them as
this is
objects.
The ancient art of woven 9/11 kitsch.
Right.
The funny thing is, in Afghanistan, many people would not have even understood the references to 9/11, in rural Afghanistan.
Although that was a big enough event because someone had to explain why suddenly smart bombs were raining down on them from B-52s. So I think there was a little bit of maybe some of these rugs were explanatory. Like, see,
this is why the B-52s.
Yeah, all of a sudden, all these guys in beards are driving around in 4-wheel drive like Jeeps.
Mark Wahlberg is now here,
shooting everything.
Mark Wahlberg and drones, and it's all because of this.
Well, and speaking of drones, now the latest iteration of these rugs are just pictures of drones,
wow.
and they look like. And they're drones of different sizes.
Because that's the face of warfare to a civilian now.
And it looks like drones as you would see them from the ground. Big ones, small ones, drones everywhere. And they're spooky because, it's no longer tanks and grenades. It's just these drones on a background of blue.
It's kind of come full circle to the birds or whatever, except, a deadly kind of bird.
Different kind of bird. So these rugs now do live primarily in a secondary market. You can buy them, if you will believe this, you can buy them at overstock.com because people import them kind of in bulk and then find at their rug gallery or whatever that these like Twin Tower rugs aren't really selling.
It doesn't match the drapes.
And so now Overstock.com has actually quite an interesting selection. They're not the finest quality, and the collector's market, like for everything, you're not going to buy just any satin jacket with a map of Korea. You want the earliest ones, the ones from the 50s, and that's true of these rugs too.
Well, a lot of these artisanal wares from the developing world, once you get a mass audience, you start to get in trouble with child and forced labor, and I wonder if that's an issue here.
This is a traditional handicraft that was always made by women and children, and there's no
like iPods,
right? And there are no labor laws, let's say, in the mountains of Afghanistan, and so as it becomes more popular, people in the West then have, if you're looking for something to throw your hands up about, the fact that these are, and often in the designs themselves, you see a childlike idea of what a tank is. And you can look at that a lot of different ways. You can look at it as a way of transforming a tank into a graphic. But there are some that you look at and it just looks like a child's drawing.
It's like a refrigerator drawing.
And those are the ones that are the most sort of, that give you pause when you imagine that this is a 7-year-old who's making this rug.
And he's seen a lot of tanks.
And this is what they look like. Yeah.
I'm kind of surprised you don't have a 9/11 rug here, John.
Well,
in the bunker.
So a lot of them are a prayer rug size. They're not very big, 2 foot by 3 foot or 3 by 4. And they're kind of more suitable as wall hangings. I did have a rug from this region that was actually not a woven rug, but boiled wool that was covered with graphic stitched animals, birds and dogs and sort of herd animals. I still have that. That's around. I'll show that to you later. But in fact, in preparation for this show, I went on eBay, where there are also dozens of these rugs, and bid on one. And that auction closes in 5 hours.
That's thousands of years ago to our listeners, John. They don't.
Right. But I was just outbid right before I started the show. I saw that someone else had bid over mine, and now I have a decision to make whether this is one that matters to me, that I because this is a good sized one. There are rugs that are 7 by 5, and that's, I think, the kind I would want. I'd like one as a item of home decor and not just a
there is a decor question. Is it a 9/11 rug?
No.
Oh.
I find the ones with maps and AK-40 the AK-47 ones are pretty cool, but the ones with maps and the ones with the twin towers, those seem sort of like things that you thought were cool. And then, I mean, for
like in your dorm next to your beanbag.
When I first made money as a musician, it was at a time when you could still buy a watercolor by Adolf Hitler for $5,000.
Oh yeah, he was still turning them out in Argentina.
Still turning them out, right?
But like, these are all Paraguayan jungle settings now. What the hell?
He did so many of them during his period when he was a frustrated and failed artist. And there is such a small market for something that was painted by Hitler. And I was intrigued just by the idea that you could own a thing like that, not as a thing I would like. It's not like I would celebrate it, but that you could just for money. I mean, right now, Audrey Hepburn's ballet slippers are on sale at Christie's. And someone is going to buy Audrey Hepburn's slippers.
I bet they smell.
And put them in a glass case in their living room.
Even Audrey Hepburn smelled when she did ballet.
But when I thought more and more about actually owning a watercolor by Hitler, like, it's not a thing you would put on the wall. I wouldn't put it on the wall. And if it was in a closet somewhere, it would haunt me that it was in my house, right? And it was a thing that the initial idea of it was like, oh, wow, I'll buy
it's so transgressive.
A watercolor by Hitler. Whoa. But then I'm not going to put that on the wall. Like, what kind of conversation piece is that? Hey, welcome to my house. Oh, you like that? That's by Hitler.
Yeah, you don't have to say it. It's a lovely watercolor. It's a conversation piece about these flowers.
Even now, I'm just grateful that I didn't do it. And I think now there are enough creeps in the world that Hitler watercolors are too expensive to buy. So maybe I missed out on that.
You were saved from the better angels of your nature.
Yeah. And I feel the same way about a 9/11 rug. Not a thing I want in the house.
Well, say what you will about 9/11. It really tied our foreign policy together. And that concludes War Rugs. Entry 1411.SS0604, certificate number 39950, in the omnibus. Speaking of things, purchases that will not age well, John and I were avid social media users in our day, and we're available at all times with quips and reactions on the news. Love to hear the offended quips and reactions from random drive-by irritants.
I'm sure that somewhere in the future there will be some like octopus that collects Hitler watercolors that's super bummed that I cast any aspersions on them at all. I mean, I suppose history.
He should be grateful you kept you were keeping the market alive.
Right. This may be the thing that he's like, who's got those? I mean, I think now if you had a watercolor by Genghis Khan or a watercolor by Charlemagne, no one would remember their terrible crimes.
Charlemagne killed so many Saracens or whatever. Like they would just be like, really? The Charlemagne?
Yeah.
So at some point it becomes really the Hitler?
Yeah, there's going to be an octopus in the future that's like, yeah, there's nothing wrong with this. He's just a historical figure.
It's just the time to buy a watercolor by some guy named Dave Hitler. And then you can tell people, yeah, this is by Hitler.
Well, when in the 80s, it was really popular in the early 90s to have paintings by Gacy. You could write John Wayne Gacy and he would paint you a clown. I knew a couple of different punk rockers that very transgressively had serial killer artwork.
I wanted to have Charles Manson just scrape a pentagram into my forehead. And luckily I thought twice.
Yeah, well, that, visiting day is only once a year with Chuck.
And they don't let him have anything sharp. Our social media accounts, speaking of the Manson family, our social media accounts were at Ken Jennings and at John Roderick on Twitter and, in John's case, Instagram. This project was represented at Omnibus Project across a plethora of platforms. Instagram, Twitter,
A plethora.
Facebook. A single plethora, not multiple plethora.
Right.
We were available via email to interested parties suggesting addenda and errata at omnibusproject@howstuffworks.com. There was even a forum of like-minded scholars who collected their findings on a Facebook group called Futurelings.
Listeners, from our vantage point in your distant past, when there are still tribes, when the world is still divided into nations, where we don't all speak a single language and are not all either mochaccino colored, all of us, or have learned to appreciate the rainbow of peoples.
It'll be the end of Orientalism when we're all part of a global world government and we're all mochaccino colored. I mean, there's no excitement of the Baluchistani nomads you've never heard of when, everybody is just an Earthian.
True, but there might be Oceanism, where beings from the land, oxygen-breathing beings from the land, are somehow discriminatory against beings from the sea.
Or space.
Or space, right?
Sure.
So who knows?
It'll just be space Orientalism. It'll be from the eastern part of the galaxy. There actually is an old Star Trek where they're trying to reference Jim Crow, and they say it's a backward planet in the southern part of the galaxy. Like the galaxy has a south. What exactly is the magnetic North Pole of the galaxy?
It's down there by the Martin Luther King asteroid band. I guess it depends on whether you are a Hobbesian or a Calvinian, whether or not you think that we will ever in space and time eradicate prejudice. I guess it's the liberal/conservative question across all millennia.
The Star Trek idea is you do it, but only so you can smugly tut-tut at the other less enlightened planets you come across that still have war and shortages and prejudices.
Right. In the future, there will always be virtue signaling. But we hope and pray that the catastrophe that wipes us out and produces that future will never come. But if the worst does come soon, this recording, like all our recordings, may be our final word. But if your gods allow...
Your octopus gods.
Because we would never presume to disparage your lords.
Get on your coral and anemone prayer mats to worship your eldritch underwater gods.
We hope to be back with you soon for another entry in the Omnibus.